Okay, so this week we're going to be talking about territorial, cultural, and economic expansion between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. We're going to talk about the aspect of slavery only next week as basically the precursor to the Civil War. But, you know, uh, we need to basically discuss certain aspects of it even this week, but we're not going to talk about it in detail. All right, so let's jump in. Just a quick revision of the War of 1812. So the reasons for the outbreak were multiple. For example, the impressment, which was the British practice of seizing American ships and declaring the soldiers, so sailors, there to be deserting British sailors and kidnapping the sailors and capturing the ships. Also, that because of the Napoleonic Wars, the Americans believed that this would be a good opportunity to get some more territories or get something from the British. And also the fact that the British were funding the Mississippi Indian Alliance with guns and helping them in other ways. So first, the Americans managed to be successful in capturing parts of what would today be Canada. But then the British attacked the United States in the Mid-Atlantic region, and they managed to occupy Washington and burn it, and also bombard Baltimore, which is important from a cultural perspective, as the US national anthem was written about this event. In the South, at the same time, at the final battle of the war, the Americans managed to be victorious under the leadership of Andrew Jackson, who was a young general at the time. He managed to defeat the British to a great extent at the Battle of New Orleans. But this was already after the peace treaty was signed, unknown to Andrew Jackson in Europe, and the Treaty of Kent, where both sides returned to their original borders. So there were no changes to the borders, but at the same time, the Americans did manage to achieve something, because the British realized that the US is a foe to be not to be taken lightly, and there was no war between the two countries after that, and it was the beginning of the long, friendly, special relationship between the United States and Britain that lasts even in our present day. So between these two wars, the War of 1812 and the Civil War, was a period, the 19th century was a period of rapid economic development. Unprecedented growth took place, and these were the beginnings of an American capitalist economy. This was the time of the first industrial revolution, where the United States was still not a core area, but Britain was. And if you remember from your high school studies and from British history from last semester, the British were very much engaged in the textile industry. And the textile industry was very important. And one of the raw materials for the textile industry was cotton. And the southern part of the United States was a major cotton growing area, and the British need for cotton really helped the economic development of the country. The aspect of the Industrial Revolution that did affect the United States to a great extent was the Transportation Revolution. And the United States so many canals were built, there were steamboats, and railroad tracks were laid, especially in the north. So the north became more industrialized. And the trade also affected the United States, so they were selling cotton and tobacco for Europe, and wheat, and they received manufactured goods. So in a way you can say that this is like the continuation of the model that was typical during the earlier periods. Well, in agriculture there were new inventions such as the cotton gin or other inventions that made agriculture more simple. The cotton gin, what you should know about it is that it made the processing of the cotton easier, and it became more expansive, which means that it was expanding. So it became more important to settle the West because they needed the territory for the agriculture, especially the cotton. So in the South. Interestingly and conversely enough, unfortunately, the inventions in agriculture actually contributed to the survival of slavery, because without the cotton gin, so during the time of the writing of the Constitution and the founding, slavery was on the decline. But with the appearance of the cotton gin, suddenly, producing cotton became more profitable. So slavery enjoyed a resurgence at this time. And because of the economy, the sectional differences in economy as well as in society that we're going to talk about later were becoming more pronounced. The North was increasingly becoming more urban and industrial, whereas the South more rural and agricultural. And of course the third section of the country would be the West, that was very wild. So the party system. If you remember, when we talked about the writing of the Constitution, there were two political parties, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists, already by the time of Jefferson's presidency in the early 19th century, changed their name into Democratic Republican. The reason for this was obviously because they didn't want to be anti-something, they wanted to stand for something. And so it is the same party, just a change of name. And the Democratic Republican Party used to dominate the political field after the demise of the Federalist Party until it was reformed into the Democratic Party in 1828. So what you see on this side of the political divide is that it is the same party being renamed several times. Whereas in opposition to the Democratic Party, the Whig Party emerged. It was basically based on disillusioned Democratic Republicans as well as the remains of the Federalist Party. The Whig Party was the opposition party to the Democrats, or it also gave presidents from the 30s until the 50s in the 1800s. And then the Whig Party collapsed because of the conflicts over slavery. And from the ruins of the Whig Party, the Republican Party came to existence. So the big difference is that on one side you have the development of the Anti-Federalist to the Democratic Republican to the Democratic Party, and on the other side you have parties collapsing, like the Federalist Party and then the Whig Party, and not just being renamed, but completely new parties coming to existence from based on the same political base. So the 1810s and the 1820s were called era of good feelings. This is the time when basically the Democratic Republican Party was dominating the political space, and one of the presidents during this time who was very important for us is James Monroe. And it was during the presidency of James Monroe that the Monroe Doctrine, that is going to come up also later, was formed. The Monroe Doctrine was the foreign policy doctrine of the United States. What do we mean by this? It's basically the United States, under Monroe, the US proclaimed that they want non-intervention from the Europeans. So the Europeans should not intervene into the affairs of the American continent, and the Americans are not going to intervene into the affairs of the Europeans either. This is basically a time when the former colonies of the Spanish were becoming independent in Latin America, and this is what they meant, that the Europeans should not intervene. And in return, the Americans are not going to intervene into European wars either. So they said that there should be no new colonies, so the already existing colonies should become independent and no new colonies should be established. So basically he was advocating a hemispheric separation. So the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere, so the old world and the new world should be separate. They should not, there should not be empires that hold the lands on the new world. So the founder of the Democratic Party was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, you might remember from the War of 1812, he was a military hero for his victory in the Battle of New Orleans. He was a slave owner, and he was also a plantation owner, a planter. He was a Southerner and a Westerner, because he was from Tennessee. That was a Southern, but at the same time it also was considered to be part of the West at the time. And he was also like a very much like an aggressive person. He was known as the only American president, as far as we know, who really killed somebody, because he was involved in a duel. When somebody insulted his honor, a journalist, they were in a duel and he shot him to death. Yeah, a pretty controversial figure, because he had positive aspects. For example, his populism. What do we mean by this? He was very much basing his support on the common man instead of the rich and powerful. So he really wanted to establish his political base on the lower classes. He was against these moneyed interests, against bankers and big business, and he was advocating for universal white male suffrage. So this is what we mean by the Jacksonian democracy, that every adult white man got the right to vote under him. And he founded the Democratic Party, that is one of the oldest political parties in the world. He just basically reorganized the old Democratic Republicans. But his most negative deeds were the Indian Removal Act that led to the Trail of Tears. The Indian Removal Act that was basically condemning the so-called civilized tribes to move to the west of the Mississippi to basically take away their land. This led to the Trail of Tears, which was the name given to the wanderings of these poor people. So the sectional differences, as I've already mentioned in the previous slides, were becoming more pronounced between the North and the South based on the economic structure. In the North, the agriculture was made in farms, and there were also factories, and we can see the beginnings of an industrial society with a working class and the capitalists, factory owners and bankers and so on. The agriculture was mostly being transformed into self-sufficient farms, from self-sufficient farms into providing for the cities and their growing working class. At the same time, in the South, you can see plantations and the slaveholding society, where a very, very small layer of extremely rich plantation owners and a lot of poor white people, and also a lot of slaves. Another change in society was the old immigration. Between the War of 1812 and the Civil War, about 5 million people have arrived to the United States. Mostly they settled in urban areas. and mostly they were Western and Northern European people. So culturally and religiously, not that different from the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants Americans. The only big difference was the Irish, because the Irish were Catholics and they were also, a lot of them were also poor, and they created anti-immigrant feelings, and they were facing discrimination for a long time. They call this nativism, like preferring natives to immigrants in many respects. The period after the War of 1812 saw the rise of American nationalism and cultural independence. The Americans were trying to define themselves as a nation, as distinct from Britain, and also how they were culturally different from the British. One symbol of this was the emergence of American literature as distinct from British, the emergence of distinctly American voices. For example, Poe and Emerson and Thoreau and Walt Whitman and Hawthorne are examples of this, and later Mark Twain. I'm sure you've learned about these authors in your American literature classes. Also, the American English was formed, like in a way, they try to find their own language as in how it is different from the British, and they even published the first dictionary of American English as opposed to British English, which was Webster's dictionary. This included the American spelling of a lot of words like color or theater program, and to try to differentiate themselves from how the British speak. Also an important event was the Lewis and Clark expedition that was sent to the Louisiana Territory by Jefferson. This was this huge unexplored patch of land from the Mississippi until the Rocky Mountains, and these explorers were sent there to explore, like what's there, what type of animals, what type of tribes, and it was a dangerous expedition, but they came back with a lot of knowledge about that previously unknown part of the world, unknown for the Americans. This was also the time of the Second Great Awakening, which was, like the first one, a religious revival movement that was trying to find answers to problems of that world, such as like slavery or women's status, and most importantly, America's mission. They were looking to find, like trying to restructure society in a more moral way. So, in connection to this, the reform and utopian movements were sprung up, such as peace movement, also women's movement, and this was the beginnings of a women's movement in the United States. Also important was the abolition of slavery, that we're going to talk a lot about next week, and also race relations were very much looked at. What I mean is, like of course the situation of African Americans, and we're going to talk more, of course, more about this next week. So the territorial expansion, how did it happen? Well, there were many motivations for going west. First of all, the land. Especially after, we're going to talk about this next week, the Homestead Act by Lincoln gave people, like if somebody went west, they could get land for free. And this was especially attractive for those who came from Europe, where land was very scarce. Like if you remember from Hungarian history, there were a lot of landless peasants. For them, getting land for free was just unimaginably good. And also the abundance of natural resources, the most important, of course, being gold. There was the famous gold rush in California after the US acquired it from Mexico, which contributed to that state being populated very quickly. And of course, trade was important. Trading with the native tribes, trading with like other nations in North America. Also, there were missionaries who wanted to go there to teach the natives religion and about like science and reading and so on. Of course, a spirit of adventure. There were a lot of people who just liked the unregulated aspect of the Wild West, and like they were hoping to get very rich very quick from the gold or some other reasons. Well, there were many obstacles. For example, there were natural obstacles. I mean, you have to understand how dangerous going to the West was. You know, like it meant going on one of these wagons that you can see in the picture, going through rivers, deserts, mountains, having to face with the terrible climate of the deserts, or like snowstorms in the mountains or whatever. So it was diseases. So a lot of people actually died of the way in the way. There were also financial obstacles. The US was often in debt because the country had to pay for purchases of land, and also, if not land, then wars, because a lot of this land was actually not empty, in spite of what some people believed. It was occupied by other countries, such as Mexico, or by the British, and or by the natives. And another obstacle, a political obstacle, was slavery, because there were always big debates about whether a new area should be slave owner or not slave owner, so say slavery should be allowed or not. So let's talk about the ideological justifications. The ideological justification was the so-called Manifest Destiny that was first used by John L. O'Sullivan in the Democratic Review in 1845. And it is symbolized by this picture called the American Progress. What it meant was that Sullivan said that it is the God-given duty of the Americans to occupy and civilize the continent, to give land to the yearly multiplying millions of people, to go to the West and, you know, like bring about, as you can see here, agriculture, electricity, railroads, civilization to this uncivilized West, where you can see, you know, like dangerous animals and, you know, the uncivilized natives hiding and so on. Another theory that was created later, that basically after the time of the West was over, was the frontier theory by Frederick Jackson Turner, who was talking about the significance of the frontier in American history. While Turner's theory was that it was the West that made America America, that it was the Western experience of having to survive in a dangerous environment that made real Americans from the Europeans. So the Europeans arrive, they go to the West, where they have to be practical, hardworking, and you know, like ingenious to come up with solutions to problems and so on, which makes real Americans out of them. And of course, there was the religious justification by saying that they have to convert the natives to Protestant Christianity. Let's just mention the darkest chapter of the westward expansion, which is the Native Americans. This is very negative because it is characterized by a lot of wars that were pretty unequal. You know, the natives were very often weaker. I mean, although they did fight back, and you know, it doesn't mean that living in the West was not dangerous for white people. But a lot of treaties were signed with them that were eventually broken, and there were many diseases that were spread among them, and you know, a large part of the population died, and those who remain today, a lot of them live in reservations which are very poorly run, and you know, like it's not a good place to be. So in the South, they were basically autonomous nations that tried to organize themselves based on, you know, like similarly to the European nations, they were called the Five Civilized Nations. The Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole. You don't have to remember the names of these tribes. They were basically used, like they tried to adopt a lot of the European customs. They started to have post offices and organize their own government and so on. But Andrew Jackson in 1830 signed the Indian Removal Act. That was exactly what the title says, that they had to move to the west of the Mississippi. And the Trail of Tears in 1838-39 was the forceful relocation of these 5 civilized tribes to the west of the Mississippi River, to the present-day Oklahoma. That was called Indian Territory at the time. This is called the Trail of Tears because these people had to leave their ancient homeland, and also this deportation, because I mean this is exactly what it was, resulted in the death of a lot of people, especially because it happened over the winter and a lot of old people and children couldn't survive. So in the West, the biggest issue was with the Sioux Indians, who are, one of them example is Sitting Bull, who you can see here. In the 1860s and the 1890s, Sitting Bull was a Native American leader and medicine man, and he was the leader of the Sioux at the Battle of Wounded Knee, where they managed to have a victory, but eventually they were defeated and forced to reservations. And unfortunately, Sitting Bull himself was killed on a reservation by the so-called Indian police, because they were afraid that he's going to start the war again, in spite of the fact that, you know, like, he peacefully surrendered. Another episode of the West was Buffalo Bill. You know, Buffalo Bill was not a Native American. He was white. He was a trapper, a hunter, a showman. For a while, Sitting Bull was also part of his show. So he became famous, and then he realized that, you know, he could make some money out of this. He became famous as a hunter. This is why he got the nickname Buffalo Bill. During the Civil War, he was feeding the northern troops with the buffaloes that he hunted. And he created a show that was kind of like a circus that presented an image of the West that we can see in westerns even today, of, you know, like sharpshooters and cowboys and Indians. And this is interesting because for a short while, Sitting Bull himself was a part of his traveling troupe. And can you imagine this? You know, like a real Indian chief, a real hero, being involved in this circus. Actually, it's an interesting fact that they also visited Hungary, like not Sitting Bull, but Buffalo Bill's show. And they even had a show in Debrecen and Szeged and some other places. So he's important because he created this image of the West that became popular worldwide. So let's see how the westward expansion happened. We've already talked about the Louisiana Purchase, which happened in 1803. And in 1818, it was followed by the Old Northwest. So the British and the Americans made an agreement that the 49th parallel would be the border between the British and the American territories, and the territory of the Louisiana Purchase. If you look at the map, you can see that the British gave up a little bit of territory, like quite a bit of territory to the south, and the Americans gave up some territory to the north of this line, just, you know, to make it easier to decide what belongs to whom. Then in 1819, Florida became part of the United States. What happened was that after the Napoleonic Wars was over, Spain, that was the colonial, like, mother country of Florida, was considerably weakened, and the former Spanish colonies were becoming independent, including and the Americans wanted to get Florida, and basically the Spanish gave it up. They realized that they're not going to be able to keep it. But Florida was not the only area that became independent, but other Spanish colonies in Latin America, including Mexico. Mexico, the southern neighbor of the United States, became independent in 1822, and they started inviting American settlers to the territory that was known to them as Texas, the present-day Texas. And what they wished from the American settlers was to be loyal to Mexico and to learn Spanish and to become Catholics, none of which they were willing to do. They wanted to become Americans and stay Americans. So in 1836, the American immigrants to Mexico declared their independence, and Texas became an independent country, the Lone Star Republic. Originally, they wanted to be adopted into the United States, but the Americans were afraid of this because they were afraid that if Texas becomes part of the US, then this is going to strengthen the South too much. Texas was a southern slave-holding area, and the Northerners were afraid that if Texas becomes a part of the US, then it is going to increase the power of slavers. Eventually, the United States annexed Texas in 1845. The annexation means when a small country is basically engulfed by a larger one. And secession means when a country breaks away from the other one, and cession is when one country gets a part of the other. So what happened was that the US annexed Texas. So once again, annexation means like a smaller country becoming part of a larger one. And immediately the war broke out with Mexico. Mexico still considered Texas to be their territory. This 2-year war was ended by the Treaty of the Guadalupe Hidalgo. So, what is this about? Well, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the US defeated Mexico and decided to take not only Texas, but the California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico areas as well. This is what they call the Mexican cession. As opposed to annexation, when a country takes over the whole territory of another nation, at the cession they just cut off parts of it and take it. So the northern part of Mexico became the United States. We don't have a lot left. At the Oregon Territory, basically the British and the Americans decided to just continue the line and to the Pacific Ocean, and except for Vancouver, which is the little thing that you can see in the corner, this became the border between with Canada, or like the British colonies, and the United States. Another thing was the Gadsden Purchase. A lot of Americans felt that the Mexican cession was unjust because the US just took a part of Mexico by force. So the Gadsden Purchase was this smaller piece of land, which is still pretty big compared to Hungary, that the US bought from Mexico. And a lot of people felt that this was kind of like a compensation for the other territories that they took by force as well. This was needed to build the railroad because this was the easiest place to reach the eastern part from the western part. Then came Alaska, that was bought in 1867 from the Russians. A lot of people were against this at the time. They felt like it was a waste of money, but then they realized what a good business it was when oil was found and gold was found in Alaska. It was one of the best deals in the world, actually. And Hawaii in 1898, the situation was similar to what happened in Texas. Hawaii was an independent kingdom, and there were a lot of American settlers who were demanding to be annexed by the United States, which actually happened. And the final note was the Spanish-American War in 1898, when Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines became controlled by the United States. Cuba was semi-independent, Puerto Rico became a part of the United States, and the Philippines was also part of the United States for a while. And as you can see, by this time the United States became a colonial and imperial power itself. Okay guys, alright, so this was it for today, and I'm looking forward to your 2 questions. Please prepare them for next week, for next class. Alright, bye.